This is week 2 of Web 1, and today we are moving into Chapter 2, but we have a little bit of Chapter 1 PowerPoint slides to finish up. And if you remember from the last set of videos, I purposefully stopped at this spot on purpose. And the reason for that is we start to talk about the markup languages themselves, and I didn't want to hastily go through it. I wanted to give you all the detail that it deserves, especially as we go into Chapter 2 and we go full force into coding. So I think it matches up a little bit better. But let's talk about the history of markup languages, where they come from, and kind of where they're going. You see on the slide here, that first bullet, they talk about a markup language called SGML. Standard Generalized Markup Language. And what this was designed for was for the printing environment. Back in the early days of electronic prepress, we had kind of this conversion that happened where, remember when people used to set type by hand? Did you guys ever have to do that in class, in school? Okay, that just kind of dates me, I suppose. But when I was in junior high school, we had a class where we did typesetting, and we would take little lead pieces of type, and we'd put it into these forms, and then you'd put all this stuff in there, and then you get ink on it, and you roll the ink over it, and then you put paper on it, and it prints. And that's how newspapers were printed for a really, really long time. But they got to the point where they were starting to take the content of what would be pressed and converting it to an electronic format, and then send that to a press that could read it and output it. And the way that they developed was a system called SGML, where they would basically put markup tags around sections of text to say, this is a heading, this is a subheading, this is a quote, this is body text, and they had very simple little markers for that. And that language, which was designed for printing, was called SGML. But little did they know, they actually kind of started a little bit of kind of a revolution in that, so wait, we have a way where we can take plain text, put some stuff in there that will tell some output mechanism to do something different than just the plain text. And that's really what kind of drove the idea for HTML, same basic principle. So HTML originally grew out of this language, SGML. And the type of approach that you're going to see as we go into Chapter 2, where we use brackets and we put in things for like bold and italics, that stuff comes from SGML almost directly. And interestingly, when I first started out with using computers way back, and I was using an Apple IIe, and one of the first real word processing programs I got was a program called Quark, not the desktop layout program, but the word processor. And for me, it was a revelation when I could do things like put in bold, except we didn't use the same kind of tags we use now. It was like capital B, lowercase b, or reverse, I forget. But it was so cool because I could cut and paste and copy, and I was no longer bound to a typewriter where I would write all my papers on typewriters. You'd have to do it all by hand, move stuff around by hand. You guys haven't experienced that, but that was like a revelation, because all of a sudden I could edit my work and I could emphasize things and italicize things, and it was so cool. So that was kind of my first exposure to it. So SGML kind of grew into HTML, but ultimately SGML really graduated to become this language, which is called XML. And the X stands for extensible. XML really is kind of like the parent language, I would call it, for all markup languages. SGML was the start, but XML has become the core. So XML basically is a markup language where you can create your own tags. Now, you guys are going to learn in HTML it's a little bit different. You have to use the tags that are pre-created. But XML allows you to create your own tags as long as they follow a strict rule set. And that rule set then can be used to generate documents, databases, or how it's been used a lot is to generate other markup languages. So like the rule set for HTML is written in XML, which is kind of a fascinating thing. And you're going to see there's a lot of commonalities, but this is really considered like the core markup language. And remember when I said that it had a strict rule set? So in other words, you had to do things a certain way, like if you open a tag, you have to close a tag. Original HTML did not require that. And that would cause a lot of problems, especially when we started to apply things like styling, or if we wanted to write code to make the page do something aside from just sit there. So they had to come up with a strict rule set, and what they came up with was a thing called XHTML. And they kind of actually developed kind of in parallel with HTML. HTML went from versions 1 through 4, and it stayed at 4 for a long time, while XML kicked in with XHTML. And XHTML became kind of like the default standard before HTML5 because it did follow a rule set which allowed it to work with CSS for styling real well, and it also allowed for coding of objects that you could manipulate. Because then the strictness is what allowed that to happen. So we had kind of like this parallel development of both XHTML and HTML. But when they got to the point of working on new standards, basically, going from XHTML1 to whatever was going to come next, they kind of went back to HTML5 and kind of put some of that strictness into HTML5, but had a little bit of the flexibility of some of the old HTML stuck in there to boot. And we're going to see that when we're working in the next chapter. But I think that's an important background to understand as you're moving into HTML5, that it does have a history, and you will, in your work as a professional, once you get out into the field, you will encounter old code. There's lots of websites that are out there that still run HTML4 and earlier, or XHTML. In some cases, you'll see that XHTML has usage other than just web pages, especially when working with server-side code, where we require the XML namespace to be present. And if that means nothing to you now, in a couple semesters it'll mean something. But it requires that namespace to be present in order to be able to make certain types of code execute, because we require the strictness of XHTML and XML to make it function. All right, well that is basically the wrap on Chapter 1 and a good little lead into what we're going to do here in Chapter 2. Now, for those of you that are watching the video and here in class, the PowerPoint is available on the course shell. So at the very top of Unit 2, if you go there, you will see there's a link to the PowerPoint if you want to download it and take notes. The PowerPoint does mimic the flow of the book almost precisely, with a little bit less detail. I wouldn't say that you should just look at the PowerPoints in this lecture. You should still read the book, because there are some details that I will present in a different fashion than the author will. And I'll try to kind of give you a balanced approach, because he's teaching very formally all the different techniques that are involved, and I'll be peppering in kind of my commentary, and I want you to understand that it's commentary about practical real-world usage on things. There's certain things that they'll push in the book that I just don't do because I just think it's silly. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It might work for you, but I'll try to make those things apparent. And then there's certain things that we do, they'll show you some techniques that I don't see people using at all, but are out there. It doesn't mean that they won't be used. Some of this stuff is pretty new, especially with HTML5. So there's kind of like an adoption curve that comes into play. All right, the topics for this chapter you're going to see listed here. You're going to see we're going to do a little bit of review of that topic that we were just talking about. But then we're going to learn about the basic page elements and then build a web page basically as we're going through the chapter, learning some of the most fundamental pieces of HTML. And in the process, I'm going to be showing you little techniques for how to write the code, what tools to use, etc. If you do have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. It's okay that it comes through on the recording. People listening often have the same questions. All right, so let's talk about what HTML is once again. Basically, when we talk about, what does HTML stand for as an acronym, that is in your book. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Hypertext is this concept that actually dates back quite a ways, back into the 1940s, where some guy came up with this idea, wouldn't it be cool to be able to touch a piece of text in the book and get a definition or take you to a piece of information that explains what it is, right? So that concept of hypertext really goes back quite a way. But HTML is basically the language that we see in the browser that makes the browser display pages the way we intend them to be displayed, hopefully. There's an organization called the World Wide Web Consortium. You can see at the bottom of that slide there. I showed you their website, W3 Schools. That's a great site to get information. But they are the ones that set the standards for HTML, and they have since its inception. So that isn't going to change. Interesting thing about HTML, it says each markup code represents an HTML element. You'll see that. So everything that we put on the page has some reason for being there, and you're going to see that we're going to be using what we call brackets to surround our tags. And I'll show you how to use those in a little bit. But those are very key symbols in an HTML document, because the first one that you see here would denote the beginning of a tag, and the second one would denote the closing of a tag, and they have to be used in tandem. So that's a pretty common thing that you're going to see. Actually, required thing. So what's with HTML5? Well, HTML5 is the latest approved standard of HTML. It became a standard, I want to say, about 2 years ago in the winter. I think just as we went into 2015, you might want to actually do some research on that. Don't take my word for it. But it has been around in draft form much longer than 2015. So the last 2 years it's been actually a standard, but prior to that people were using it pretty extensively even while it was being written. Because of the power that XHTML gave us, it allowed us that flexibility because it's based on XML. So it allowed us to do things like create these new HTML5 tags, and then by doing a little bit of clever CSS and JavaScript, you could make that HTML5 stuff work in just about every browser. So that was kind of neat. But eventually what happened is some of the things that we were doing in the draft versions of HTML5 did become part of the standards. There's a couple of things that were taken away from the draft and either pushed to later or just completely eliminated. But they basically experiment with the standard first before they make it a standard. Once they make it a standard, what happens is the browsers then need to become compliant with it. Truth is, the HTML5 was pretty well supported by most of the browsers even well before it was an approved standard, with some exceptions. Most notably Internet Explorer had a lot of issues, and that's mostly because of the way they chose to handle some of the CSS that they were working with. So, and there's, little stipulations that we make in our code to kind of accommodate for that. We'll learn about that as we go. But there's so much cool stuff that was added to HTML5. Many simplifications and improvements that really make our life a lot easier as coders. Things, for example, like they show on the slide here, how like audio and video is like now natively supported, as opposed to using this like crazy looking like segments of code to try to make it work with different devices and still having problems. Now audio and video are just there. The browsers are required to support it. We don't have to write really cryptic strings of code to make it work. And there's other really neat things too. For example, like there's built-in validation for like HTML form elements, for example. That's a really big step forward too. Lots of little things. One of the keys that you're going to see when you're working with any of the languages that are built on top of XML is the fact that we have a thing called a DTD, a document type definition. And what that basically is, it's a rule set that we will state at the top of every one of our documents. And basically you're going to make a declaration called a doc type that says, hey, this is what I'm using. I'm using HTML5. or for or XHTML. This is the rule set I'm following. So browser, pay attention, render my code as if this is the rule set I'm using. And that's a really important stipulation. So, knowing that, the importance of it, if you were to eliminate that doc type declaration at the top of your page, you're going to have problems with it working properly with CSS and working properly with JavaScript and other coding elements. In many cases, stuff will just not work without the doc type. But if you declare a doc type and you say, I'm going to follow a certain set of rules, you better follow those rules. And there are tools to help us validate. We're going to learn about those things. Now remember I told you about XHTML. Take a look at the doc type for XHTML. Got that? It's going to be on your test. No, I'm kidding. But that's what you would have to put at the top of every one of your documents if you wanted to use XHTML. And if you look really carefully there, notice it says doc type HTML public, and then it has something that kind of looks like a URL. And notice, DTD, doc type declaration, XHTML 1.0 transitional English. That's what it stands for. Right, and you're supposed to memorize that. And believe it or not, that URL that's on the next line, that's actually a link to the rule set. And any DTD file is actually an XML file that declares what the rule set is for that. So it's saying this is the rule set. Here's where it's located. Make sure I work according to this. Now notice in HTML5 what they did, absolutely brilliant, right? They just switched it to plain old HTML. And it's so much easier to remember. And in many cases, and this is something you should know, if you are working on some old pages that are using XHTML 1.0 or 1.1 or strict or transitional or whatever, in many cases you can just very simply replace the doc type and it will work just fine. There are some little stipulations here and there, so that's just something handy to know. The key is you have to follow the rule set. And if you built an XHTML page, chances are your rule set was pretty strict anyhow, so the HTML5 stuff would work as a doc type. It is designed as a doc type to be backwards compatible. So in many cases, you can also use it with HTML4 and not run into too many issues. But if you know that you're HTML4, I would still encourage you to use the HTML4 doc type. And yes, there is one for every version of HTML that looks just as friendly as that XHTML one up there. So let's take a look at a sample web page. And this is the kind of stuff that we're going to be building here. And what we're looking at here initially is the core structure of the page. So notice at the very top of the document, it says doc type HTML. It is prefaced by an exclamation point. That is required if you want to follow a rule set. And if you want to have a page that does something and looks good. So remember that. It's got to be there. The second line, notice that we have our opening HTML tag, and it also has what we call an attribute added to it. In this case, it says lang equals, in quotes, en. What does that mean? Yeah, the language is English. That is, by many intents and purposes, I would say an optional attribute, depending on what your audience is going to be. It's considered good practice to put it in. A lot of editors, depending on the tool that you're using, so tools that, let's say like Dreamweaver or Visual Studio, that would auto-generate some of these components for you. I forget which includes it and which doesn't, but it's considered good practice to put it in. Will things break if it's not there? Absolutely not, because guess what the default language is for the web? English, so we don't have too much to worry about. But if you do have a target audience outside of the English language, then you can actually make provisions here for that. All right, so the doc type declaration, oops, I didn't mean to move that, sits on its own basically. Okay, does not have what we call a closing tag. It's kind of like one of the few tags you're going to work with that's going to be like that. So it's a declaration at the top. All the other tags on the page, though, if you're noticing, have a closing tag. And if you see here, HTML as a tag, at the bottom has a mate with a / sitting in front of that H. So that's the closing HTML tag. And that, because it appears first on the page as its first proper tag, will need to necessarily be the last tag on the page too. So everything else has to be encapsulated within it. So when we look at real basic HTML page structure, doc type is at the top, then opening and closing HTML tags encapsulating everything else. So everything else needs to be within those tags. Then we have two additional sections of the page. One is the head section, and notice we have an opening and a closing head tag, and that encapsulates some more tags. One of them is the title tag. Notice an opening version and a closing version. Then we have another standalone tag, and this one is what we call a meta tag, and this is a special tag. It's also considered good practice to include this, because what it's telling us is that we are using a computer character keyboard code set that's predetermined. Now, it just so happens that most of the text that funnels through the internet tends to work on what we call UTF-8, basically meaning what binary characters are used to compose the signal that creates the letter that we're using. And there's many different ones. And for us, once again, because we're working in English, it's not much of an issue. But UTF-8 is considered the standard because basically it is basic text. Where you start to see that value change, once again, is if you're working in different languages. Interesting thing about UTF-8 is if you ever have been in the habit of looking at the character key maps for fonts within your system, have you guys ever done that? Never looked at the character map? All right, well, here's a chance for us. So it's called the character map. So any font that's on your system, if you look through it, for example, right now I have Arial up on the screen, and you see all letters of the alphabet, numbers, symbols, right? And you get down here, and it's like, oh my God, what's all this stuff? Do you notice the scroll bar? There's a whole lot more there than just, the few things that you see. And for those of you that speak foreign languages and can read and write them, you'll start to recognize, letters like this. See, I recognize these. These are Greek. This is the Greek alphabet that's built into Arial. Yep. So when we're looking at things like UTF-8, there's character key codes that go with these groupings that allow you to generate, in many cases, languages that go beyond the standard English characters. So when you start to see something other than UTF-8, it indicates that people are dropping in characters from different language sets, typically. But most all web work is done with UTF-8. One of the reasons we put that in there is when we start working across different servers, Windows servers, Linux servers, they actually use different character key codes, and this is one way that we can ensure that we're going to use a consistent set of them. All right, so that covers the head section of the document. And usually what we put up here is a lot of different stuff. One thing that we might put are links to external resources. So for example, CSS or JavaScript. And we can either code those things directly into this section, or we create links to the external files that hold them. In the bottom area, we have the body. The body, once again, opening and closing tags. And notice it says body text and more HTML5 tags go here. Yes. In fact, the body tags are what should encapsulate what we would consider typically as the visible portions of the page. Not that things that are up here couldn't be visible, but they're done through special techniques where the stuff in the body section is intended by default to be visible on the page. So we type in some text, we create a paragraph or a heading. This is where we would put it. So that's the general rule. I know in the next slide here, he starts to talk about this, right? The head section contains information that describes the web page document. And once again, it can just be information or it can be different types of resources, scripts, styles. And the body section is the stuff that's going to display on the page. All right. So the thing that we're going to do next, and first we're going to look at this example, is we're going to go ahead and we're going to create our first HTML document here. Once again, taking a really quick look. Are you noticing that they're using Notepad to do the coding, which is a tool that's built into Windows? You can actually use that to do all your coding if you want. It is very primitive. We already learned last week, about how to manage files and stuff so that we can see the file extensions. Notepad is not very friendly with working with that, but you can use a primitive tool, absolutely. The demonstration that they're really giving you here is they're showing you that they built the basic page structure, and they're showing you that the stuff that you put up on top, notice how the title, where it says My First HTML5 Web Page, do you see where that ends up in the browser? Yeah, it ends up in the tab. So what goes in the title tag ends up in the tab. And that, of course, should be wisely planned, right? Because when you think about how many tabs you have open, and the more tabs you start to open, man, like the first couple things, first few letters of whatever that says, that's going to be pretty important. So that's going to be the thing that somebody goes, well, where's that web page that I was looking? Oh, yeah, there it is. So that's one of the things that you can strategically plan. But that is what will show up in the tab. And then notice down here in the body section how we have just a snippet of text that says hello world, and that's what will show up inside the browser. So what we're going to do right now, folks, is we're going to jump in and we're going to start doing a little bit of coding. Now, as we start to get into the coding thing, I am going to start talking about the different types of tools that we will be using. You see that on this PowerPoint slide, the author is using Notepad. And I am just immediately going to push you away from that because I want you to use a quality tool to start with. And one of the de facto tools for many coders in terms of a basic text editor is a tool called Notepad++. I know I talked about it a little bit last time, but not in any great depth. If you're interested in downloading this piece of software for your own usage, just type as a search Notepad++. It'll be the first thing that comes back, and you'll get a link straight away to download it. It's freeware. It originates from Linux platforms. It's part of the GNU project, where they were building open source software. Where if you were interested, you could probably download the source code and make your own text editor if you want. But it is an excellent tool. It's absolutely free. And there's a lot of different choices for installs, and typically just hit the big green button, download and install that. So all of machines here on campus, those of you using school machines, the software is preloaded. If you do not have it preloaded on your machine, then this is really a good opportunity to do the download and install. For those of you using Macintosh machines, let's see, one Mac person, you will have some different options. And actually, it's kind of nice that you're here. There's a really cool few tools that you might want to consider using. One that I've used for many years on my machine is called Text Wrangler. That is a freebie also. Okay, that's the one you're using. And this one also stems from a Linux background, and somewhere in here there's a download link. I'll let you guys search for it on your own. Another good option for a Macintosh is, believe it or not, Yeah, not Visual Studio, but Visual Studio Code. Um, Visual Studio Code is this new product that Microsoft released this past summer or spring, something like that. Um, but what's really neat about it, right, instead of being a Windows-only thing, it also works on Linux and Mac operating systems. And it is just a basic text editor. Okay, so it's not really, it's not Visual Studio where you have a full-blown IDE with a debugger and a compiler built in. This is just a text editor, but it is a rich text editor in terms of the fact that it supports many languages, not just HTML. So I really like this tool, and I do work on a Mac at home, and when I'm doing straight text stuff lately, I've been kind of moving towards this as a preferred tool in many ways. Because once if you're used to it in one platform, then you can move over to a PC and it's the same there as well. Another one in terms of straight text editors that's very powerful and free and highly recommended is this tool here called Brackets. And the URL, if you can read that, is just brackets.io. This is another one of these free tools, and you can see what it looks like. It is originally created by Adobe, so it has some similarities to some of the Adobe products. Now, it is not Dreamweaver, right? And if at all possible, if you have the capability of getting Dreamweaver, I would encourage you to do that. But this is a great free alternative. Once again, it does not have a debugger and a compiler built in, and it can work with just about any language you can think of. And people create all sorts of little plugins and add-ons and extensions. But it does HTML, CSS, and JavaScript beautifully. It has some of the IntelliSense tools that come with it. And if you don't find ones that you like, people have created extensions where you can download like IntelliSense for JavaScript. And it does some pretty neat things. Probably the coolest thing I think that it does is the fact that it has this little lightning bolt button, and it allows you that once you've created a page, you can hit that button and it live updates in the browser as you're working on the page. Now, I get a lot of people, I turn them onto this piece of software and they never leave it. It's that good. I tend to stick with Notepad++ in class because that's just kind of more my de facto. So I haven't done a lot of heavy coding in Brackets, but I've done enough to realize that it's basically like a poor man's Dreamweaver. Like Visual Studio Code is compared to Visual Studio. It's kind of the same type of comparison. But if you don't want to drop a lot of money and you're just doing a lot of straight code, it really is a great tool. And it's free. And the source of it comes originally from Adobe, and they constantly update it, and people create all sorts of stuff for it. And this is kind of interesting as we move through the course. Another thing you guys should keep in the back of your head, this product here is actually a web page. The whole thing is coded in JavaScript. I know, I get looks from people. Yes, absolutely. If you research the product, so they created an editing tool that really is a glorified web page. Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. The other thing I should point out to you is there's lots of actual like online cloud-based authoring environments too that you can go out and use. I won't spend any time talking about them tonight, but between the three that I think I just showed you, you should be fine. Brackets does exist for Mac as well. I don't know if it runs on Linux. I would probably guess that it does because of the way it was coded. It probably would work on a Linux machine too. But between those three tools, you should be able to do anything you need in this class. So pick one of them to work with for tonight. I'm going to be working with Notepad++, so I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And I have it pulled off to my second screen here. Now, despite its very, very primitive look, don't let that deceive you. It is a very, very powerful text editor, and like Brackets, has a gazillion plugins you can add to it. It's got FTP built in. You can actually add compilers and debuggers to it and make it a full-blown IDE if you choose. I use it basically just for straight text. Even for like day-to-day usage, like if I'm gonna like type up a grocery list, I go here. So, but it's a excellent Notepad replacement, and it does color coding and supports probably more languages than any other text editing tool natively. In fact, if you look at their menu here for language and you start to go through the menus, they have so many languages they support that they have to like break it down by letter. So you get an idea of like the kind of stuff that it has built in. And that means it has color coding. It does not do IntelliSense in the same way Visual Studio does, but it does become predictive after a while. All right, so this is the tool I'm using, and all I did is I created a new document. There's a little new button here, or you just go to File, New. And I'm just going to begin by creating the basic structure here of my HTML document, starting with the doc type. So to do that, the book will show you all caps on doc type. You got to make sure it's spelled exactly correct, and then HTML. Truth is that doc type can be lowercase. It's okay. But most formal textbooks will show it to you this way. That simple declaration indicates that it is HTML5. I'm putting in the opening HTML tag with the language attribute. And then watch my technique here now. I'm going to encourage you guys to try to follow this technique. Before I create any other tags, I'm creating the closing tag for the tag I just created. Right? And I want you to do that. And I'll keep saying it over and over again, so don't worry about that. Now, to kind of help develop a little bit of a hierarchy here, you might want to do this, is I'm going to indent for my next entry. So I'm going to come in one tab, or if you want a space, that's up to you. And then I'm going to put in the next section of the document, which is the head section. Once again, I'm putting in the closing tag right away. Now, I've gotten in this habit because if you ever work with a fancier tool like Dreamweaver or Visual Studio, the moment that you create a tag, it closes it for you right away. And then you just start typing. And the problem is if you're used to that and you come to this, then you forget to do the closing tag. It's like, why isn't it working? So my habit has become, and it's really a good way of like preventing errors in my mind, is you create that opening tag, create the closing tag immediately if the tool doesn't do it for you. So doc type at the top, opening and closing HTML tags that encapsulates everything else. Everything else is inside those tags. Head section at the top. So this contains basically special instructions, information, script styles, or links to external resources. That's what we would put there. Body section at the bottom. This will be the visible page content. One of the first tags you learn to put inside the head section will be the title tag. Opening and closing. Notice I put the opening and closing for this one on the same line. The other tag that they tell you to put in is kind of a standard. And you will get to memorize this stuff over time, is this meta tag. Now notice the meta tag, there actually is special meaning to meta tags. But notice it doesn't have a closing tag, right? Like we're not doing this. And the reason for that is because there's nothing that goes in between. All the information is actually contained within the attributes that are added to the tag. If you were working with XHTML in strict mode, you would still have to close it. So this is one difference between HTML5 and XHTML, and the way you would close that is like this. So if you ever see any HTML tags that don't have a separate closing tag, but have a closing slash inside, we call that a self-closing tag. Meta tag is one of those that can utilize that. XHTML requires that closing slashes in there. HTML5 says, I don't care. So that's considered okay. Now, believe it or not, what we have so far is a good template for creating future web pages. What I might encourage you to do, and you don't have to do it right now, but you might want to create yourself a document that has just this in it. So if you don't have a tool like Dreamweaver or Visual Studio available, where you just say new HTML5, boom, it creates this automatically, you might want to just save this as web template, or call it whatever you want, and then every time you go to make a new web page, you can just pull this up, and you got those tags already typed in correctly, and you don't have to type them up from scratch. Not that it's hard, but that's just a recommendation, especially if you're working with manual editors like this one. Okay, so thus far, we have what we call the basic structure of the page. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to do what they did in the PowerPoint, and I'm going to do the obligatory hello world. I'm just typing it in there as plain text. All right, so we're basically up to the point where the book is. So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and save this file. Oh, but this opens up a whole new conversation. File management. And how you should organize your files for this class. So actually, before I hit save, I'm going to drop down to my file system and do a little bit of file management first. All right, so let's go to our File Explorer. And you can see that, I keep all my stuff, in a certain spot on my machine. I use Google Drive for all my school stuff. So I have like local folders that match up with my cloud folders. And I have a folder set up for my Web Programming 1 class. And then I have a folder for this semester. And this is what we did last time. We created this file and we threw it in there. So what I'm going to do, though, is I realize that every week I'm going to be working on new stuff. And it's going to make a lot of sense for you to either create folders for each week of class or each unit of homework, or you're going to see that we're going to be working on certain case studies, like we're going to be doing the Java Jam Coffee Shop and Fish Creek and all these different projects. So you're going to have to find some way to create folders that will contain your stuff on an incremental basis. So in other words, if you're going to work on the Java Jam Coffee Shop, you probably want like a week 1 version and a week 2 version, etc. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is to create folders either for each unit or for each week, whatever works in your brain. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going to create a Unit 2 folder, because that's what we're working on today. We're working on Unit 2. Notice when I named it, that I named it all lowercase, and there's no spaces in that folder name. That is by intent. The intent there is when I move it up to the server, up to Kronos, I don't want to have to worry about, what did I name it? Did I put a space in it? Right? Form the habit now of whatever naming convention you're going to use. My personal convention, and a lot of developers, when they're doing straight up HTML, is to use all lowercase for folder names, and for the most part for file names too. If you decide to use Unit 2 with a capital U, you better remember that. On a Windows machine, you can probably interchange the U with a capital U, a lowercase u, and it'll probably work. Same is true on a Mac. You put it on a Linux server, no go. It's got to be precise. So if you form a habit, it'll help you quite a bit. So all the stuff I'm going to do is going to go into that Unit 2 folder. So I'm going to go back to Notepad++, and I'm going to hit the save icon, and it's going to ask me where to put it. So I'm going to navigate my way to that location. You'll probably get to yours a whole lot easier. I'm trying to remember where my Google Drive is located. Okay, there we go. The one thing I will discourage you guys from doing, though, is using flash drives to store your stuff, if at all possible. Especially as primary storage. You want to use it for backup or for moving stuff around, I think that's fine. Now what we're going to name this very first file is going to be index.html. must be, absolutely must be, all lowercase. Index.html is the standard file name for home pages. It's the default. If I choose to use uppercase letters, it will not work. I'm not going to call it homepage.html. It's going to be index.html. That's one that you guys will get to know. Notice what happened when I saved it? How it color-coded everything? Because now it realizes I'm working with an HTML file, and now all the color coding that goes with it will be present. And what's useful about that is if you start to break things, sometimes the color coding will change and indicate problems. And I'm not really triggering it to cause much of a problem right now, but when you get more complicated code structures, it'll start to recognize those things. So you can see what is really considered to be plain text, how it's bold and easier to read. So that's just helpful. So I'm going to save that. And now that it's saved, I can look at it a couple of different ways. The one way that you can look at it is you can go to that folder and then just double-click that file, and it should open up in whatever your default browser is. And for me, that's Chrome. And you can see there's my little hello world. Isn't that exciting? If you are using Notepad++, just a helpful little tip, and I know a lot of people do this, is you can come up here to the Run menu. And if you hit Run, it'll go, well, what does an HTML5 file or HTML file require to run? It'll go to whatever the default is for that file extension, which on my machine will be Chrome. But you can also come in here and specifically target a browser from this interface. So if you want to do that, I guess I could demonstrate that. You can hit Run, you can pick Chrome, and it comes up in Chrome. So hopefully everybody was successful with that. One tip, if you're having a problem, and one of the problems that you might have, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about last week, is if you save that file and that icon here does not look like one of your web browser icons, like it looks like the Firefox logo, which is like this, or the Internet Explorer or Edge, that's indicative of the fact that your file extensions might be messing you up. In which case, if you're using Windows 8 or 10, you want to click on the View tab and then make sure that file extensions are visible. Because you might have that situation like we talked about last week in the video where it might have like a .txt or something like that, and that's not good. Because then when you double click it, it'll open up in your text editor, and that is indicative of the problem. If you are using Windows 7 or earlier, you can get to the same spot by hitting your Alt key, and it'll bring up a menu, and then what you're going to look for is folder options under the toolbar. And I think we demonstrated that last time as well. All right, since we got this very first effort of ours to work, we are going to take a break here in class, and we're going to come back in a fresh video.